Phillip Bennett. Dr. Phillip Bennett, Reverend Dr. Phillip Bennett, is an Episcopal priest in our diocese and a psychologist. And I've known Phillip for quite a number of years, and he's been joining us at St. Paul's on a number of occasions for our adult forums. And we are so happy that he is joining us today, as he will be speaking on hope. Hope in the time of, well, I'll say in the hope of time of COVID, but of course any other issues that we have during this pandemic year of 2020. So please welcome Phillip Bennett.
Thank you. I'm going to speak for maybe 20 some minutes, and then I welcome any kind of dialogue we'd like to have. The title is called Hope in a Turbulent World. It has been quite a year. Who could have imagined that we would be meeting on Zoom, unable to sit together, to be in each other's presence? Where once we could move freely in the world, now we must cover our faces, stand apart, restrict our gathering, and forego celebrations that were once natural markers of time. Vaccines look hopeful, but we know they will take time to distribute. It may be a while before we are able to resume life as we knew it. And when the worst is over, we will be left with scars from this time, a kind of collective PTSD. It will not be easy to simply shift from caution to comfort, from a fear of contagion to being close together and touching each other again. In time, we hope life will return to something like the old normal. It is likely that some caution will remain. Life has been changed forever. Like previous generations that have undergone great traumas, we will never forget this strange time. It will mark us forever. This turbulent year has been marked by another trauma. We have witnessed the continued violence against Black people as we watched the grisly footage of a man being stepped on and held to the ground under another man's knee for 8 minutes as he cried out for his mother. There have been many other such instances. These acts of violence prompted massive demonstrations across the country and the world. Seething pain and outrage were spilling over into the streets, demanding change. In the midst of this, some took the occasion to exploit the situation to commit acts of violence, setting fires and looting. Whatever the varying motivations of those who demonstrated, it was a powerful emergence of energy in the midst of our social quarantine. In addition to the pandemic and social unrest, we are experiencing a chilling rise of nationalism here and throughout the world, in which dictators seek to control through stirring up fear and prejudice, where reality is distorted and undermined so that the real news is considered fake news and the fake news is considered real news. This trifecta of these three traumas, the pandemic, racial injustice, and political polarization, have made many of us deeply unsure of what the future will bring. And then there is the ticking time bomb of climate change. The earth is reeling against our mistreatment. Fires, floods, droughts, the death of animal species, rising temperatures and rising seas. These all remind us how precarious the fate of the planet is. The future of our human race will be filled with many unknowns. We cannot see how artificial intelligence will affect unemployment, how the climate will affect international social unrest, how the population density of some of the poorest parts of the world will affect life in the future. Although every generation has faced challenges, it can be argued that our generation is facing challenges of such magnitude and so numerous that there is more and more to dread and less to be hopeful about. In his first letter to the Corinthians, St. Paul names what have been called the theological virtues: faith, hope, and love. Paul says that the greatest of these is love. We all know that beautiful hymn to love, If I speak with mortal tongues and the tongues of angels and have not love, I am nothing. It is a moving passage we have often heard at weddings. It reminds us that nothing we do has true meaning and worth unless there is love. But what of the other two virtues, faith and hope? We hear a great deal about faith in religious circles, but I would argue that hope is the virtue we hear least about, except in terms of some other life, the hope of the resurrection, the hope of the life to come. What about hope in this world, in the messy here and now, the uncertain and often seemingly hopeless aspects of the challenging world in which we live? For hope to mean anything, it must be distinguished from naive optimism. Hope does not mean simply looking on the bright side of things, of seeing the glass half full instead of half empty. Instead, hope is the belief that there is always something more to come, and though that something may be sometimes bad, it may sometimes also be good. Hope is the conviction that the future will not be just more of the same, but something new which we cannot yet fully see. We may think we can discern some outline of the future, but because it is the future and not just an extension of our present reality, it is forever a horizon that is mysterious. After Paul writes of faith, hope, and love, he moves on to the evocative image of looking through a glass darkly. For we know only in part. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Whatever knowledge we have is always partial. The mirror is always dim. What is to come is always uncertain, unfolding, and not fully imaginable. At this turbulent time in history, there are so many dark shadows in the mirror that it can be hard to be hopeful. There is good reason to be anxious about what lies ahead, but hope is the conviction that in all the uncertainties that lie ahead, there will be good things that emerge. One of the areas of hope is, I believe, human inventiveness. Not everything we humans invent is used for good, of course. From the first time a human being picked up a rock, that tool could be used for good or ill. The rock could be used for building, grinding, hunting, etching art as an object of worship, but it could also be used to murder other human beings. It is not the tool itself that makes it good or evil. It is the human being that uses it. Since the Industrial Revolution, we have seen more inventions than at any time in history. From textile mills on to the steam engine, electricity, telephones, television, nuclear power, medical technology, the rapid expansion of the cyber world, and the emerging field of artificial intelligence, we continue to create new extensions of human intelligence and communication. Will it be possible, for example, that climate change will be lessened by technologies such as carbon capture, satellite space mirrors to deflect the sun's radiation, or other technologies yet to be envisioned? When human beings move into an urgent survival mode, often when economic well-being is at stake, inventiveness often increases. We see this with the rapid inventions of vaccines for the pandemic. On the human plane, necessity can promote new ways of interacting, new forms of community, commerce, and culture. Although it is popular to decry technology as dehumanizing and undercutting social interaction, it can also promote a greater communication and collaboration that goes beyond geographical or temporal boundaries. We can make new friends and colleagues with a flexibility and immediacy never before possible. The internet, like early stone tools, can be used for good or ill. It can foster hate and disinformation, but it can also bring people together in new ways of cooperation and innovation. And we're doing that right now. One thing is for certain, technology is not going away. We can choose to be hopeful about it, even if it carries dangers. Having faith that there is more good to come in the future requires an openness to the new and often unexpected. The letter of the Hebrews says, Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. When we are hopeful for the future, we are having faith. Another word for faith is trust, that there are things we cannot yet see, things that are only flickers in a dark mirror that hold promise for good, for healing of the planet, healing of relationships, for a better quality of life. None of this is guaranteed, but one thing is for sure, the world will not hold still. Change will come, is already coming, is already here, whether we like it or not. The Jesuit paleontologist and mystic Teilhard de Chardin believed that we as a human species continue to evolve. We Homo sapiens are not a finished product. There is more in our human life and nature to unfold. Teilhard saw evolution on Earth in terms of three stages. The first was what he called the geosphere. This was the formation of the Earth from rock and molten matter. Next came the biosphere, the evolution of plant and animal life on this planet, of which we are a part. The third phase is what he called the noosphere, from the Greek word nous, meaning mind. Teilhard envisioned this as a kind of mental envelope, a shared and expanded field of consciousness and information that encircled the globe, connecting people's minds and thoughts in a way that transcends the body and ordinary time and space. This idea might have sounded fanciful at one point, but with the advent of computers and the internet, this is now a reality in which we live, move, and have our being. We are connecting this morning in this noosphere. Without it, we would be vastly more isolated during this pandemic. Although it is not the same as being with each other in person, it is a godsend during this trying time when we must often relate in disembodied ways. When this pandemic is gone, our ways of connecting and working will be forever altered. We have heard for a long time about how technology will transform our lives, and it certainly has had before the pandemic. But now we are forced to live in cyberspace in a more radical way. For example, many conferences may shift to online formats, saving much carbon emission through less travel. It makes it easier to log in from anywhere. But of course, this will also affect the hotel and service industry, so every major shift affects the greater picture in ripple effects, some of which bring challenges as well as conveniences. We long for the things that technology cannot give us, for gathering together in person for worship, for dining, entertainment, for sports, for human touch, and for singing together. These can never be replaced by online interactions. But we have, in Teilhard's word, fully entered the world of the noosphere, where we are no longer just Homo sapiens, we are now techno-sapiens. Living in this noosphere brings both great promise and great peril. In the stroke of a key, we can reach out and make creative and healing connections, or we can just as easily spread misinformation. The internet is very porous, and that makes it both flexible and stressful. We never know when the next influence is going to go viral. It is an unbounded terrain. Things morph and multiply very quickly. And we are not fully independent agents on the internet. We are tracked by those who want to sell us things, whether those things are material or ideological. Through algorithms, we receive news that fits our own perspectives so that people can develop radically different views of the world and of truth because they have been marketed for their traffic on the web. Although the web is supposed to connect us, it can also divide us. It can be a bridge to different world views, or it can become a silo in which our own worldview is reinforced without challenge. In observing evolution, Teilhard saw movement from lesser to greater complexity. Biological life began with simple single-celled organisms and has developed into complex organisms such as we are. As complexity has increased, so has consciousness. The larger size of our craniums has made us more adaptable, more capable of complex thought than our hominid ancestors, who have not survived the winnowing out of evolution. Not everything survives in evolution. There have been many dead-end species that are now extinct. In our darker moments, we might wonder whether we too could be one of these unfortunate species if we keep going the way we are. The move toward greater complexity is evident in human history. We have evolved from smaller, self-contained tribes into cities where cultures meet, collide, and integrate in new ways. Our world is now so pluralistic that we cannot return to the old ways of being when our identities were more homogeneous, living with people like ourselves only. This is the great tension of modern life, how to retain our own individual identity while being open to others who differ from us. In younger generations today, old lines of identity have broken down dramatically. There is more fluidity in terms of how one identifies, whether that identity is national, ethnic, racial, religious, or sexual. Graduate students from countries outside the United States often refer to themselves in terms of a third culture. They identify not with the culture of their origin alone, nor with living in American culture. They are, in fact, a third thing. This is happening in the area of sexuality as well, where identities are becoming more fluid. People are not a static this or that, they are their own blend, which defies old categories. In the face of such diversity and shifting identities, it is no wonder that there is retrenchment by those who want to return to some previous time when things were simpler and more homogeneous. Forward progress often involves some regression to a previous way of being. Moving into the emergent unknown often brings a backlash, a desire to turn back the hands of time, to put things in reverse, to go back to the past, to some better time, or at least some imagined better time. In the face of the increasing complexity of life, there is an attempt to stop change, for change is seen as bad. Perhaps it should be no surprise that the more complex and interconnected our global life becomes, the more there is a rise in nationalism. In the face of pluralism, fundamentalisms, both political and religious, abound. These fundamentalisms seek to provide a simple answer to complex problems. Those who do not have hope that a new unity is emerging out of diversity can be drawn to authoritarian figures who promise a better, simpler day. Perhaps the polarization we see is an inevitable and even necessary part of our evolution. The Spanish mystic John of the Cross spoke of the dark night of the soul. This dark night was not, John thought, a negative thing. It was not a lack of faith, but instead a necessary part of growth, a hopeful movement into some new and deeper experience of the sacred and the self. The dark night is painful because it is a stripping away of the familiar. It plunges us into the unknown. It creates a time of painful disequilibrium where we feel lost and hopeless. We feel abandoned in the darkness, and all old signposts seem to have disappeared. We feel lost and we cannot find our way. John's fellow Carmelite, Constance Fitzgerald, extends John's concept of the dark night to include the world, and not just the individual. She speaks of our society and the whole world coming to a point of impasse. Old ways of looking at the world no longer work. Institutions have broken down. We are faced with problems that seem insoluble. The way forward seems unclear. The old landmarks no longer guide us. The unknown awaits us. But in this impasse, this collective dark night, Fitzgerald believes that seeds of new life may already be present, even when we cannot see them. She says, we often see only signs of death because we do not know how to read these kind of signs in our own inner lives and interpersonal relationships. We do not understand them in our societal or national life either. Is it possible that these insoluble crises are signs of a passage or transition in our national development and in the evolution of humanity? There are plenty of signs of death around us. The most immediate and obvious is the pandemic, which is sickening and killing a staggering number of people. But there is also the death of social institutions, the tearing of our political fabric. The power of racism is still strong and has raised its ugly head with new boldness. The planet is suffering more and more and needs our urgent care. These are all reasons to feel despair, but to despair would be to close off the possibility of new life coming to us in the future. Even though it may seem like an insoluble impasse, our collective dark night may be birthing something new, although we cannot yet see what it is. Something old is dying, the old order of white privilege, of assumptions of superiority over other races, ethnicities, religions, and sexualities. And it is dying hard, creating great negative energy which binds people together in blind devotion to a cause and a leader. This blind devotion undermines, dismisses, and ridicules notions of truth and falsehood. I remember these words said by the Anglican preacher and poet Herbert O'Driscoll at a clergy conference I attended years ago. O'Driscoll said, "Nostalgia is the perversion of memory, and dread is the perversion of hope." Nostalgia is the perversion of memory, and dread is the perversion of hope. When we refuse to remember things as they were, with all their mix of good and bad, and flee to a nostalgia in which we idealize and sentimentalize the past, this nostalgia is defensive, a refusal to accept the reality of the present. In a similar way, dread perverts hope because it closes off our openness to the future by presuming we know how things will turn out, that they will turn out badly. Certainly, there will be bad things to come, but there will also be good things. But they will not necessarily be good in the way they were in the past or are in the present. They will be things yet unseen, things coming into focus through a glass darkly. If we have fear for the future, and fear is a very realistic feeling in the face of the great threats that face us, this does not mean that our fear and our hope are necessarily contradictory. Fear can drive us to action rather than paralysis. Rosemary Houghton says, "The fear we have to live with is the fear for the human community, but the fear releases our hope, drives our work for one another, calls us to humility and heroism, and rewards us with the joy of companionship." Faith, hope, and love. Perhaps the greatest of these is in some ways love, but without hope the people perish. In such a time as ours, when there is a great temptation to dread and hopelessness, we need to cultivate a radical hopefulness, not a naive optimism, but a courageous openness to the future. This is not a passive process. It requires our full activity in building up a better world. Daniel Berrigan said, "If you want to be hopeful, you have to do hopeful things." I leave you with one more image from Herbert O'Driscoll. He says, "We are yet even now being carried in the womb of our mother, the future. We cannot yet see her face, but we already feel her heartbeat. To feel this heartbeat, to believe in the face of our mother, the future, yet unseen, the face we now see through a glass darkly, is to seize the gift of hope, which we need now more than ever." So I welcome thoughts, responses, anything that comes to you, either about what I've said or about what you're experiencing during this particular time.
Well, thank you, Philip. Yes, indeed, hope seems to be, of the three theological virtues, the one least reckoned with and talked about. But it's an important virtue, isn't it? And we so often think of faith as being so profound and love being so important that it's good to unpack this idea of hope.
Indeed, what would be the value, the meaning of love or faith if there weren't hope?
Exactly.
They would be short circuited somehow.
I think of hope as having to do with time. And as I said, we do speak about hope in terms of the resurrection. Perhaps that's one of the principal ways we hear about it in Scripture. But I think about it in terms of time and things unfolding. To love each other is to continue to attend to what is happening and the challenges that we face. And certainly we're facing tremendous challenges right now during the pandemic. And to trust as well, faith, to trust that the future, as I said, can bring good things. And of course, that requires our constant collaboration. And it seems that crises or tragedies can bring out the best and the worst in humanity. And I think we see that. We see it now with the fear, isolationism, but also with people extending love and care, working together in collaboration.
Philip, thank you very much for that very powerful journey, a journey of hope. I wanted to get your reaction to some recent concerns about democracy and the role the faith community is playing in either upholding and supporting democracy and undermining it with theocracy. And certainly the recent opinion of the Supreme Court around the role of churches and faith communities in COVID, I think was a great shock to many of us right now. What's your sense? In some ways, the agents of hope, the faith community, if you consider particularly the Jewish Christian traditions, we have been the sort of vehicles of that message, and that seems to be perverted, to use that wonderful image you quoted from Herbert O'Driscoll. What are you seeing in terms of American faith, either supporting that value or undermining it?
I think it's hard for us sometimes, some of us who live in our own particular bubble, to really understand how important it is for other people to have a certain worldview in order to make meaning, and how threatening it can be when that meaning is challenged. So I think it could be easy for us to cast stones against people who see the world, the religious function in different terms. I think, I guess, as I said before, that this is a great struggle in terms of how you look at the world. I think, for example, people I have known, including myself to some degree, who come out of other kind of what I call more rigid is a judgmental term, but a certain kind of set theology. It's very difficult to have that challenged and opened up. So I think there's that dimension that it's difficult for us sometimes to understand and empathize with people who need a kind of particular worldview sustained. But then there's the other piece, which I think is insidious, which is people who have no interest at all, I think, in religious faith, but who see the anxiety people have about change as something to be manipulated in order to gain power. And that, I think, is much more insidious. It takes people's fears of change and it manipulates those in order to gain sheer power. And some of that power is economic. It's about control of the economy, control of people's minds. And so I guess I see that as an insidious thing that's really behind some of this stuff. You know, you can have legitimate different worldviews and theologies, but who is it that is manipulating that kind of conflict or stoking culture wars. They're often people who don't give a fig about religious ideas at all, but see this as such a powerful place for people to identify that they manipulate that struggle.
You know, as I think back over several visits that Philip has paid us, and there was one especially in which the subject, I'm not going to remember the title exactly, but we need a larger God. And it's not that God needs to get larger, but that we've got to conceive of God as larger, to understand, and that larger God would be addressing many of the concerns you're raising right now, that the very narrow, rigid view of God is not really doing us great service.
A very limited view of God, the God that we perceive in that beautiful chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians, seeing through a glass darkly, where we don't really see the full picture on this side of the veil. And Christian hope, isn't it really also about the long view, seeing through the lens, seeing through God's lens, that indeed God does occasionally allow evil so that a greater good could come out of it?
One of the things I think I talked about at some point when I was there before is the vitality of dogma. And this seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? Because we often have presented dogma as being restrictive. But if we thought about dogmas as kind of collective intuitions about the nature of God, we have some very potent dogmas in the Christian tradition, which I would argue are, if not unique, are particularly distinctive. And one of them is the incarnation. And from earliest times, theologians have extended, well, St. Paul himself, in terms of the body of Christ, that image of God becoming human flesh, to say that we cannot speak about God without speaking about humanity, and humanity individual and collective. So I have this image sometimes of the human race as a kind of organism, and that we actually, a lot of the healthy growth is already happening, where people are connecting, and they do this in person or across the internet. I mean, there's solidarity that's arisen because of COVID. And we sometimes might think of that as secular, as outside the religious world. But that's how a lot of the good is really happening in humanity, where people are connecting with each other. And if we saw that as incarnate grace, I think it's no longer some abstraction. In other words, we love each other either at a distance or close up, and we're building up the world that way. Another one is Trinity, and that one, seems like it's so abstract usually that we don't even see it as a useful thing, right? As I say, it's two men and a bird, right? The old image. But I mean, if you think about it as expressing the reality of unity and diversity not being mutually exclusive, but actually being mutually creative, doesn't it make sense that all of us, if we're in good relationship with each other, bring out each other's individuality, and in being more who we are, we also develop a deeper unity, which is not what Teilhard said, unicity, which is all being just the same. It's union requires a difference, and that unity is not only sustained but nourished. And I think that's one of the challenges of the pluralistic world. And to speak to the previous question about the role of religion now in society and the legislation around it, can we see that the secular world, in quotes, is really a place of grace as well? And of course, then the third we have is atonement, and the reality that non-retributive suffering can somehow move beyond, or at least extend grace in situations where it would be so easy to retaliate, right? There's some mystery that happens in the cross. And if it's not what was called substitutional atonement, the idea that Jesus gets it in the back, God takes it out on him instead of us. If it's really more the sense that there's some mystery of absorbing evil and making something new out of it, then that's a powerful, powerful reality as well, right? I mean, it's so tempting to strike back, and there's so much to strike back about because we have the domino effect of people, particularly nations, injuring each other, and then the retribution for that injury creates yet another retribution. So I don't know. I mean, I think that we have some very important lenses through which to see things. And I don't think these are abstract. I think that every day we have these opportunities, you know, to be extensions of grace. I think there's the challenge to our own narcissism of wanting people to be the way we are instead of celebrating diversity. And I think we often have the challenge of wanting to, you know, return evil for evil, or at least go into our own negative withdrawal and fail to, you know, get off our own throne of judgment. So, I mean, I think these things are day by day, moment by moment decisions that you and I make. You know, one of the things that I didn't mention here is gratitude. I don't know about you, but I am so grateful for the things that I used to take for granted, to be able to simply walk out in the world with freedom, to be able to mingle together. Certainly in the cathedral, the passing of the peace is robust. People mill around and they hug and they kiss, and people of all walks of life, from CEOs to homeless people, have an opportunity to touch each other in that way that really levels us, is all connected. I mean, I don't know where that's going to be even after vaccines. The idea of contagion is so real. Singing, right? We know that now we're able to literally touch each other through droplets in ways that can be deadly. I think it's going to take time for us to be able to navigate that whole business of touch, gathering, the things that we've really not been able to do during this time. But how grateful I am, you know, and I look back and I think, I took these things for granted.
So can we say, I wonder if the ideal that we've often held sort of almost mindlessly, it seems to me it's become, of church, separation of church and state, so it becomes so absolute in our minds that we've cut off at least half, if not the larger dimension in which the state really needs to be seen in order for to continue as humanity. I guess I'm questioning the sort of mindless holding up the ideal of any kind of commingling of church and state is anathema, leads to disaster.
Right, and even when you say separation of church and state, isn't that a way of expressing the connection between the church and the state, right? When you're trying to pry the two of them apart, you're doing it through the vehicle of the state, which in this case is the Supreme Court. So I think that's specious argument. It's where we come down on the political spectrum that's the issue, really. It's not whether we divide up church and state. That there are very different worldviews, and I think it's hard for us sometimes to get that. And some of us have a hard time believing that other people can really live in a very different worldview. I mean, we know it abstractly, but what's it like to live there and to really have these tenets with good faith and tenets that some of us disagree with, you know?
Yeah, you know, as you're talking about that, Philip, I'm thinking about the early Jewish discussion of the nature of the Messiah, and that early Jewish conversation that he was a warrior prince going to come and fix it. That's now become a central Christian conversation, and you have a significant number of Christians in the world who are looking to the warrior Jesus coming back to fix it. How do you counter? I mean, how do we hold together? And I would say that the controversy around the Messiah, I'm fascinated why that is such back to your point about these principles of Christian doctrine are really important. And that at Easter time, Jesus is always correcting them of the nature of the Messiah. Can you comment on that to our present era, and who's sharing that gospel, or how is that tension part of the creative process?
Well, I was thinking back to the doctrine of the cross. You know, what is power, right? And is power being able to subjugate other people? Is it power to define people according to one's own judgment? I think that there was a reason, obviously, why they sought the Messiah, right? They were in a time of great, great crisis, and it would make sense to have somebody lead them and somebody to be able to vanquish the enemy and restore the kingdom. So that's a very appealing idea, because let's face it, pluralism was challenging then as it is now. There was you know, I mean, this is a little tricky. I don't know, are we recording this part of the discussion?
Yeah, I can switch it off if you want to.
No, I can. Let me see if I can maneuver around this, because, you know, sometimes we make an assumption, even in certain circles, that everybody in our circle is going to think the same way politically, and that might or might not be the case. But let's say that a woman who was interviewed recently spoke about a particular political figure and was asked how she could, in good conscience, as an evangelical, vote for this particular political figure who seemed to contradict a lot of her own evangelical tenets in terms of lifestyle, in terms of honesty, in terms of real Christian conversion, right? Holiness, as we would call it. How could you vote for somebody like this? And she said, I didn't vote for him to be my pastor. I didn't vote for him to be my husband. I voted for him to be my bodyguard. There you see the use of what I call secular power to kind of maintain a worldview, right? To be my bodyguard. So that image presumes that you're under attack, right? You could even be killed. And therefore, in the face of possibly being killed or killed off, you'll go ahead and use any lever you can to kind of protect yourself. So I think that that's striking. I don't know. It's, you know, the whole business of hope. I guess as I tried to sketch out, it might sound cavalier to say, well, why not be hopeful? But the fact of the matter is there's always more to come, right? And if we look at the history of the human race, there's been a lot of tragedy. There have been plagues and wars, but there's also been a development over time, right? You know, we seem to get more inventive. We seem to find new ways to adapt. And frankly, I think the role of self-survival is not to be underestimated, right? I mean, often people don't wake up until they realize it's my crops that are affected by drought. You know, it's my home that's going to be covered over by rising seas. I mean, let's hope it's not too late to get that message, but it's, you know, it's out there until it affects me. And even in the face of pandemics, right, this has spurred tremendous medical advances. So maybe sometimes we change, you know, because we have to, not because there's some kind of great ideal that prompts us. And we've done a lot of that as a human race. Doesn't mean we can't kill ourselves off. I mean, Teilhard, you know, even though he had a hopeful idea that we're moving towards what he called the omega point, where the Christification, where we've become more and more part of a Christ action of salvation, he still believed that it's possible for us to thwart that and that things would not work out well. And this speaks to your comment, Jonathan, about evil, that it is possible to choose division over unity, hate over love. There's nothing guaranteed about our evolution. But if we believe that human beings seem to be able to adapt to increasing complexity, why not? You know, why should we presume that that there won't be new things that will be creative and good? This is a more personal question. I'm wondering if you had to use a kind of hope meter, if you think about where you have been feeling over this pandemic time and all this other turbulence, do you find yourself feeling more hopeless, less hopeless? Does it seem to oscillate for you, or do you just feel hope or hopelessness? What do you notice?
I'll take a stab at it. On a day-to-day basis, a lot of oscillation, but overall, just a kind of very calm moving forward, which I guess is hope, positive hope.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't lost hope. I feel actually very hope-filled. When I look back at human history, I see that we've continued to be, we've struggled with many challenges, and I think that is, so long as we are cooperating with each other and cooperating with God's plan, there is an end point down the way, as the omega point that we're heading towards. We're simply on a timeline, a chronological timeline, but there's also God's timeline, the Kairos.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have necessarily a picture of that quite clearly, but I do trust, and I do feel very hope-filled.
I think for me, it's, and both personally and in terms of the community here at St. Paul's, it's a kind of relating to the level of anxiety. So if the anxiety is managed, chances are that the community can hold hope for each other. Maybe not all at the same time, but it's a bit like, you know, together we'll get through this. So I've just found that, you know, and going in, we've just gone back into virtual only services, and the sense that we've done this before. This is a bit more traumatic because I think more people are going to die and be affected by coronavirus. But again, the community has to continue to serve and support each other and love each other and have hope. So the Advent season is reinforcing that, both the control of one's own anxiety and fear and opening up to all of the things that you've so wonderfully, you know, outlined today about what Christian hope can offer.
Yes, that's
Fred,
right. Yeah.
Yeah, Fred, anything you want to contribute? And is Pam still on the call?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, have you any questions or comments on that from Philip?
I don't have any questions. What I'm hearing is we have to have hope. We really do, because otherwise we will just give up. So when I think back on, I shared with you about my great grandmother and her participating in the 1918 pandemic. I know we're going to come through. We're all going through different things, and I know different individuals that have lost loved ones, sister, nieces, and other relatives. But we have to have hope. Otherwise, we just give up, just roll up and get in a ball and call it a day. So we have to have hope. We can't keep looking at what's out there, the negative, the political piece that Reverend Phillip just talked about. We have to know about what it is that we believe, and we believe that God is going to bring us through. He puts us at a place where we need to be, and we have to learn from those lessons. We don't give up. Our relatives, other people, they have not given up. And we've gone through things like this before. We've had wars, rumors of wars. We've had other kind of people. And hopefully the individuals that voted for someone that they feel as though is not evil will come together and say we have to move forward in a positive manner. Well, the people that used to look at people who lined up for foodstuffs, now they're in the line. Maybe they'll feel the pain, and maybe they will have hope to move forward during all of these horrible times that some people are going through. We talk about hunger elsewhere, but we have it right here. We have violence here. We have hatred here. But we will come out on the better side if we decide that's what we want to do.
You
Thanks,
raised a
Pam.
really interesting point there, Pam. We talk about salvation history, and you said people have gone through so much before, right? And we're inheritors of that, and we can get caught up so much in our own perspective here. But you're talking about the longer view, right? That people have survived so many things, and that's something for us to learn, and how all those Bible passages that talk about our ancestors and then being led through the Red Sea. I mean, this is a way for one generation to tell another, it's really been horrible. We made it through somehow, and we say we can make it through. And as you say, we have to make it through. It's a matter of determination. It's not just abstract belief. Fred, I wondered if you had any thoughts here.
I guess, every day there's events that could cause you to lose hope, other events that occur that give you hope. And you just have to go with the ones that give you hope. And that's just what has to keep me moving forward.
Right.
So are we rounding down our discussion? This was really a wonderful way to begin Advent. So on behalf of the St. Paul's community, I want to thank you for your insight, and we will put this on our website so others can, we can refer to it on Thursday when our newsletter comes out, so that we can share this with the larger community as well. But thank you so much, Philip.
Thank you for asking me.
Inspiring beginnings of our liturgical year.
Blessed Advent.
Blessed Advent. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip.
Stay well.
You too. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.